afternoon and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here for what is a very important milestone in the life of any author, the publication of a first book. And we're here to celebrate today with local author James Ballard and the publication of Poison Jungle. My name's Kimberly Howard, and together with Henry, we're delighted that you chose to spend your afternoon with us. I have a particular connection to this book because James and I are in the same writers group, and over the past 3 years, I had the opportunity to read the initial drafts. And it's enormously rewarding for me to see it in this format, so I can only imagine how rewarding it is for you, James, to see it. So this book is about war, about the Vietnam War in particular, and war is a difficult subject, particularly the Vietnam War, which was so contentious. And I'm really grateful to James that he was having the courage to go back to memories that I know were extraordinarily painful to write this book so that we would have a better understanding of the atrocities, the complexities, and the contentiousness of this war. So thank you again for being here and taking the time to celebrate this first novel. We're going to start with some context from James, and then he'll do a short reading. We'll have a quick break. There are washrooms here, water, as Nathan mentioned, and then we'll have question and answers afterwards. And if you would like to buy a copy of the book, they're here on the table. Chandra has them. They're available for $20. So please enjoy, and again, thank you for being here. And I'll turn it over to James.
Thanks, Kimberly, for the kind introduction. Kimberly was there for the complete writing of the manuscript, and I not only appreciated her critique along the way. She got the novel in initially, I think it was in 1 and 2 chapter segments, and then I started bringing 4 or 5 at a time. And but not only did I appreciate her critiques, but her support along the way as well. So thank you, Kimberly, and also for hosting this book launch today. So. About a year ago, a friend of mine had asked me why I was still writing about the Vietnam War. And so then he said, "Isn't there any other screwed up part of your life that you can write about?" And he even had a couple of suggestions. But the truth of the matter is that I think for me and a lot of other veterans of war, it's a very transformative experience. And my life after the war took a completely different course than it probably would have had I not gone to war. And I've been attempting to understand that ever since. And the writing about it is a further exploration of that. And if you were to sum up what's in Poison Jungle in a phrase, it would be the psychological consequences of war. And it's a very complex subject that's pretty much has held my fascination for a lifetime, basically. And there's many components of it, and this is all reflected in the novel. First, you have what I would consider the war is war part of the equation, which is pretty much universal to all human beings, actually, and we'll call it war trauma. We have different cultures, different wars, but trauma impacts human beings. And so there's that component. What Poison Jungle explores quite a bit of is certain twists and turns that were unique to my experience as a medic in the Vietnam War. And there were all kinds of twisted aspects of that, I guess you could call them. We were mostly young men sent to the war by our country, and we were scorned by the citizens of the very country that sent us to war in the first place. So I think what happened to a lot of us is that made the readjustment problems a little more difficult. Poison Jungle is not a book where that's written from a poor me type of perspective at all. It's I try to make it a lot more universal than that. Certainly, one of the impacts on me about the war was the tremendous suffering that the Vietnamese went through, regardless of what side they were on. So when we returned, we basically, in our own country, were faced scorn from not only the left of the political spectrum, in which we were seen as perpetrators of the war and some of the horrible atrocities coming out of Vietnam, but also what a lot of Americans even forget is the scorn from some of the people on the right of the political spectrum. To them, we were often seen as losers of the war, dope-smoking, sloppy-ass soldiers who couldn't defeat an underfed enemy in sandals in the jungles of Vietnam. So on top of all of that, we were in the army of a superpower that unleashed a tremendous technological arsenal on a very poor country, and the costs were staggering, actually. You had the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese on one side, you had the South Vietnamese and the Americans on the other side, and just the Vietnamese combatants alone, their dead totaled close to 1 million, just the combatants. On top of that, you had another 1 million to 2 million Vietnamese civilians die in the conflict. Beyond the killing, then of course there were the ugly remnants from the technological arsenal. The landscape pockmarked with bomb craters, the napalm burning parts of the jungle, the chemical defoliants, which was destroying lots of flora and eventually some of the ecosystems in the country, and then causing a rash of cancers in not only the immediate after effects of the exposure, but it went on not only for years amongst the Vietnamese people and American veterans, it also became multi-generational because the chemicals got embedded in the genes of and were passed on, and you see problems still going on in Vietnam itself. So how that affected me basically is there was simply no moral thread to really hang on to in participating in the war. And, despite, if you look at, say, World War II, such an enormous death tolls and devastation and destruction. Whole cities were incinerated. But I don't think I've ever talked to a World War II veteran that ultimately didn't feel there was some purpose to the war. And so in my case, there just was never a moral thread that I could hang on to in sorting the experience out. So the way that all comes together in Poison Jungle is an exploration of all of that. And the novel is seen through the eyes of Andy Parks, who is a platoon medic in the Mekong Delta. The novel itself is in 3 parts. Part 1 is set in Vietnam, and it gives the reader a sense of Andy's tour and why there would be psychological consequences resulting from the war. Part 2 is titled War Without End, and it deals with Andy's first few years of his return and basically the readjustment problems he has. It's not a solipsistic look inside Andy's head. There's lots going on that happens. There's lots more drama that happens in part 2 that gives the reader an idea of why it was that Andy had such trouble readjusting. And he realizes after his return that he coped much better in the war than he had after his return from the war. He feels he made quite a mess of his life with some of his actions, but throughout the course of the novel, I think some of the reasons for that becomes clearer, and it becomes clearer to Andy as well. And then part 3 is titled Hiding Out, and it deals with Andy achieving some sense of equilibrium with his experiences. And even 15 and 20 years out of his war, there's still the occasional incident which draws him back into the war in his head. And so as he tries to get his life in order and sort through the psychological consequences of having experienced his tour, we see some equilibrium achieved. So the first passage I'll read from the novel is from part 1, the Vietnam segment. And the part that we'll come in on is just after a firefight that the platoon has had. And Andy has lost a friend from a gunshot wound to the liver. Now, I'm not going to read from that part. It is in the novel. We'll come in just after. Camel is the friend's nickname. Andy only knows him as Camel. Everybody had nicknames. And Andy realizes he doesn't even know Camel's real name. So what's really tearing at Andy, and in the immediate aftermath of a firefight, I think it's important to understand that you're still in hostile territory. So, it's not like you really can let down your guard. And Andy is really struggling with his emotions after not only losing his friend, but he's unable to save his friend's life. The gunshot wound to the liver, where there's lots of blood vessels, and it's basically an internal injury. He can't stop the bleeding. But what's bothering Andy even more is that he simply did not comfort his friend, who is fully conscious as his life ebbs away. So some of the terms in here that I wanted to mention, dog tags are mentioned. A lot of you'll know what those are, but they're literally a metal tag worn in the war zone with your name and serial number and blood type. There's a name tag that's mentioned that was sewn above the pocket. Your surname was put on it in black. Everything was either black or green in the war zone. Howitz is mentioned, the platoon commander. And the Charlie is mentioned, which was the, I guess you could say, the nickname that a lot of the American troops used for the Viet Cong. As far as Charlie was a rather neutral term, and it's from the military phonetic system where a word is associated with each letter in the alphabet. So for VC, it was Victor Charles. So hence Charlie came, it's fairly neutral. Unlike the term, the other common term was gook, which is a racial slur, quite an ugly term. Then the scene will move into describing a night ambush, which is the platoon is out trying to intercept the mortar and rocket teams, the VC mortar and rocket teams, which are hurling mortars on their base camp. So what a night ambush does is the platoon goes out, sets up overnight, tries to intercept enemy activity. And several platoons would be out in different directions. So this is the passage from part 1. After the firefight, and after the artillery had finished demolishing the trees nearest to the rice paddy, Andy continued to function. Feeling empty, his emotions in a jumbled mess, Andy looked for Camel's dog tags. He found them tucked in the upper portion of his boot, like every infantryman is instructed to do. He needed to know Camel's real name to complete the field medical card, the medic's responsibility before putting a dead man in a body bag. Michael Gene Harris, known only as Camel to the platoon. Andy never asked his real name. He never paid attention to the tag, now stained with blood, with Harris sewn in black letters above the bulky shirt pocket on his jungle fatigues. He had no idea what part of the country Camel came from, how many brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, friends and lovers. Those closest to him would still be worrying about him, pulling for him, hoping for his safe return from the Nam. In 2 or 3 days, official representatives from the Army would arrive on the doorstep of his parents' home to inform them of their son's death. Impeccably attired in their dress greens, an officer and a chaplain would perform the macabre duty. First, Andy had to finish his own set of morbid responsibilities. He tagged the body and zipped up the ugly green bag with Camel, a bloody mess inside of it. Even then, the rest of the country would only know him as a number, part of a statistical accounting of young men dead in the war zone for the week, then month, then year. Business would be normal for most of the country. In a couple of days, not for Camel's family. The futility of the war penetrated the numbness in Andy. A lot of the guys vented their rage blindly at the Vietnamese, all of them gooks, dinks, or slopes, none of them to be trusted. Vietnam was, in their view, Nothing but a worthless, shit-filled bog of rice paddies, swamps, and jungles, full of hazards waiting to prevent them from returning home to a normal life. The members of 3rd Platoon, empty and spent and suffering, watched a helicopter ferry one of their own out of the war zone. Andy thought, maybe that's the whole point of war, making each other suffer. Somebody will eventually give up, and those that are left can stop trying to kill each other and get back to living. 3rd Platoon also knew how to inflict pain. Dong Tam, sitting on its square mile of filled-in swamp, offered a permanent target for the Viet Cong mortar and rocket crews. 9th Infantry night ambushes tried to intercept them. Andy preferred night operations once he adjusted to being in the dark, understanding the enemy operated in the same conditions. The best part was that sometimes the platoon only spent the night in the field, setting up just a few hundred meters from base camp, returning in the morning to sleep on their cots, eating meals in their mess hall, not out of a can. It was a preferred option over spending 2 or 3 weeks on patrol, sleeping in foxholes and humping heavy packs through leech-infested swamps. A lot of nights went without incident. Viet Cong mortar teams might be pounding Dong Tam, but from a different part of the jungle. The platoon would sit and listen, unable to do anything about it. Sometimes they'd hear a firefight erupt, some other platoon having encountered Charlie somewhere beyond Dong Tam's perimeter, the rat-a-tat-tat-tat cadence of automatic weapons, rhythmic from a distance. Andy learned the sounds of the jungle from the nights when no contact occurred, listening for a human presence, a snapping twig, a palm leaf rustling unnaturally. Each evening, the platoon tried anticipating the route or positioning of the Viet Cong. Charlie needed to be within 3 kilometers of the base, the normal range for the most common types of mortars. 3rd Platoon and the VC varied their patterns in a deadly guessing game. On a muggy night thick with mosquitoes, the heat of the day not fully dissipated, a 4-man VC mortar crew walked right into their position. The platoon set up, waiting, night discipline in effect, no smoking, talking, flashlights, unnecessary sounds. Andy thought the VC ought to be able to smell them, the mosquito repellents, the sweat from overheated bodies, or hear the pounding of hearts beating faster and louder when the platoon realized the enemy had walked into their ambush. But the Viet Cong also had their preoccupations, breathing heavy and struggling with the weights they carried. Empty, the 82 millimeter mortar weighed 123 pounds, broken into 3 pieces for transporting through the jungle. Each of the shells, hanging from slings and pouches, added another 7 pounds to their loads. The 4-man team, badly outnumbered and overburdened with the munitions they intended to hurl at Dong Tam, had no time to return fire. Andy caught a glimpse of a young man struggling with the weight of the base plate and several mortars just before the platoon opened up. Young men packing too much weight to carry without effort, perspiring heavily, exhausted, scared, and uncomfortable. How many times had Andy been in that situation? Over in seconds, the team had no time to react, not even to experience the terror of their fate. The platoon could not have been positioned more perfectly. Somebody guessed right. Howitz, headquarters, or blind luck, terminating 4 Viet Cong lives in a few seconds. Lieutenant Howitz organized the disposal of the munitions. Judging by the circular base plate and the size of the tube, and that 4 VC were walking it through the jungle, an 82 millimeter mortar unit. At least 25 rounds were scattered and being assembled in stacks. Once they were set up, a good team could drop fire that many of the 7-pound shells in a few minutes. Andy checked the bodies for any signs of life. Twisted into unnatural positions in death, the darkness lent them an eerie dimension. He noticed a checkered bandana around the neck of one of the soldiers. Kneeling to get a closer look, he could see a long, thick braid trailing from behind the skull. Andy took it in his hands. Vietnamese women had such beautiful hair when they allowed it to grow long. Hard to tell the age, but the corpse was clearly that of a young woman. Andy had long since grown accustomed to seeing dead bodies in the war zone. Once he had injected a dying Viet Cong soldier with enough morphine to hasten a less painful entry into death, then worried what he would do if one of his platoon members needed it. There were always decisions to be made in the Nam. There would be no difficult decisions on this night. The platoon worked quickly, readying the enemy's weapons for destruction and checking the bodies for any documents that would yield information. Still in hostile territory, 2nd Squad searched the dead soldiers while the others guarded against a counterattack. Sometimes the killing went too easily. Success in the war, measured in body counts, had 3rd Platoon up 4-0, at least on that night. Now, the next passage I'll read is on the actual flight home that Andy is on, his flight out of Vietnam. The Army, U.S. Army, did 12-month tours, and so he's immediately out of the field and on his flight home. The characters mentioned in the scene, one of the platoon members is mentioned, whose nickname is Minnesota. And he's mentioned in the context of what can only be described as helmet graffiti. The helmets, even though they were green, we had a camouflaged canvas cover that fit over them to cut down on the any glare. And a lot of the guys would mark them with black felt pen, and you often saw a kind of either a silent protest or a dark kind of humor on the helmets as part of the graffiti. For instance, some guys would draw a bullseye on the helmet, or in a silent kind of protest, a peace symbol. And in Minnesota's case, he had marked it kind of what I describe as the hurting inverse of the common peace movement of the make love, not war. He had on his helmet, make war, not love. And that's not to be interpreted literally. It was a kind of a sarcasm, not a pro-war sentiment. Other platoon members mentioned is Sammy is referred to, who's Andy's best friend in the platoon, and he appears throughout the novel. Black Henry and the professor are also mentioned. So the scene opens up on the actual flight out of Vietnam, and they're headed for Travis Air Force Base, which is the major staging area in California, in the Bay Area. The jubilation following takeoff settled into a subdued and reflective mood as the plane achieved cruising speed and altitude. Solitary thoughts replaced any need to talk for most of the soldiers on board. A flight of 22 hours separated the men from a return to their homeland after a year's tour of duty in Vietnam. Andy, exhausted but too keyed up to sleep, sat and thought about his future, now that he had one. 3 days before, he'd seen his last dead bodies in the Nam. He had no idea of the final body count of the deaths he'd witnessed during his tour. 77 alone from the slaughter in Kamau, dozens more in the battles near the Seven Mountains. Eluding death, he pondered what to do with life. He had 22 hours to think about it. After brief layovers in Japan and Alaska, excuse me, for refueling, the plane landed at Travis Air Force Base and rolled to a stop while the soldiers leaned towards the small aircraft windows for their first glimpses of a homeland not seen for a year. Andy felt a rush of excitement despite his uncertainty about the changes within the country and himself. Travis, tucked between oak-studded hills and the eastern reaches of the San Francisco Bay, looked welcoming from the air. Geographically situated for returning American soldiers from their war, the large and sprawling installation provided miles of runways for its fleet of military planes. With 11 square miles to choose from, placing the out-processing center at the edge of the base near a main thoroughfare made logistic sense for returning an army from Vietnam, also convenient for several hundred anti-war protesters. They gathered outside the building and along the 8-foot-high chain-link fence at the edge of the tarmac. The soldiers, forewarned Army style, were told how to deal with it. The sergeant came on board and gave them instructions to ignore the demonstrations. Protesters had their democratic rights, and the soldiers had their orders. Andy heard a rhythmic chant when the doors on the plane opened. No more war, no more war. Andy wanted no more war. He thought he'd left all that in Vietnam. Descending the portable stairs from the aircraft, he saw the protesters pressed against the fence at the edge of the base. Signs with anti-war slogans waved in the air above the crowd. The chanting intensified when the demonstrators saw the soldiers begin to walk off the plane. Peace now, no more war. Peace now, no more war. Repeating the phrase over and over, the returning veterans had to walk within a few feet of the hostile crowd to reach the out-processing center. Jeering protesters screamed obscenities at them. A few of the soldiers, willing to disobey an order, glared at the gathering. They shouted angry words of their own. Andy saw a grunt with an air cav patch yell at the protesters, then shrug before saying, "What are they going to do, send me back to Vietnam?" After a year of facing the NVA and Viet Cong, the long-haired hippies were unintimidating. Andy looked at the demonstrators out of the corner of his eye. A bearded young man in frenzied anger hung on the fence, shouting. Pretending to climb over and confront the soldiers, he pushed his weight against the chain-link barrier. A soldier, unfazed, took a run at him and tried to hit the man's fingers. The crowd backed away on the other side. Smirking at their cowardice, he returned to the line of soldiers. "Just what I thought," he said. "Bunch of fucking pussies. Send them to the Nam and let Charlie have a go at them." Uncomfortable in their presence, Andy just wanted to get inside the building, beyond their gaze and the noise of their shouting. He caught glimpses of signs. Peace symbols adorned the air above the jostling. Andy heard another soldier comment. "What are they so pissed about? It's us just back from the Nam, man. You asked to go there? I sure as hell didn't. Should be their turn if you asked me." His buddy, quieter, told him, "They ain't asking you, man. If they were, we wouldn't be here." Andy spotted a sign with a familiar, "Make love, not war." Remembering the helmet graffiti of Minnesota's, Andy recalled the bitter inverse stating, "Make war, not love." War-making cost Minnesota a leg from a punji steak smeared with some nasty shit Charlie knew how to scrounge from somewhere in the jungle. Another sign expressed some barely comprehensible, flowery hippie bullshit. War is not healthy for children and other living things. "Tell me about it," some war-weary grunt proclaimed, marching towards the processing building still yards away. "They gonna tell me something about the war? Fuck it, man. It don't mean nothing." Andy glanced at the crowd with just a few yards to go before entering the building at the edge of the base. A girl with a green headband holding her long red hair in place stared at him. Heavy set but pretty, their eyes locked for a moment. Her glare expressed contempt for Andy. she gave him the finger. Not back from the war 5 minutes, the soldiers received their first lessons in returning from the Nam. Andy, aged 20 and too young to even vote, knew some of the country's anti-war sentiment would be directed at him. Thoughts of Sammy, the professor, and Black Henry in a Mekong Delta jungle flooded his mind. Not one of them had asked for this war. Maybe Camel had found some peace in death. Andy kept walking, but continued looking at the red-headed girl with the long hair. Her green eyes matched the color of her headband. Inside the building, tailors fitted the soldiers with new dress greens, necessary for Andy after a 30-pound weight loss. Anxious to be on their way home, lines formed for receiving orders, pay vouchers, insignia, and ribbons earned in the war zone. And for the lucky ones, with less than 5 months military service left, discharges. Andy missed the cutoff by 2 weeks. 3 hours after landing, with everything he needed for a 30-day leave, Andy exited the double doors onto the street. Seeing none of the protesters lingering nearby, he found his way to a bus station and asked for a ticket to the San Francisco airport. Now, how's everybody doing? The third passage I'll read is from Deep in Part 2. It was kind of difficult choosing which passages to read today. There are a lot of twists and turns in the novel, and so I can't read from Part 3 at all today because reading anything in Part 3 would give too much of the novel away before reading it. And I had that difficulty with what passages to choose. I wanted to make them interesting, not inundate you with combat passages, but also make it interesting. So in this third passage I'll read, we're getting near the end of Part 2, and Andy has returned to his home. He's been there a little while now in northeastern Oklahoma. The scene opens. He's had an absolutely disastrous date with the girl he's fallen for, Lila, and he's not sure if he's, if they're still going to be seeing one another. Tahlequah is also mentioned, which is the nickname of one of Andy's friends, but also the cousin of Lila. And Lila and Tahlequah are very close, more like brother and sister than cousins. And we're in northeastern Oklahoma here, so Tahlequah is full-blood Cherokee. And his nickname is derived from the small town of Tahlequah, which was the seat of the Cherokee Nation in what was the Indian Territory. Henry Clay is mentioned, which is Andy's father, Rebecca, Andy's mother. And there's a reference to Nanyehi, who's an important woman in Cherokee history. And then this will all make sense as the passage unfolds. And then there's a brief reference to Andy not liking his name of Andrew, and the significance of that is simply that the Cherokee hated Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, and Andy was named not after Andrew Jackson, but after his mother's father, his grandfather on the maternal side. But it's a very awkward name because Andy identifies with a Cherokee more than anyone. The passage opens with Andy returning from this disastrous date. Andy returned from Lila's, expecting the house to be empty, figuring his parents would be at church. Instead, he found his father munching peanuts and watching a football game on the television in the living room. How do they do it, thought Andy, remain so content? Miserable, Andy retreated into his room. Lila had rejuvenated him, but now he felt like a moth attracted to a hot bulb only to be burned. Without her, he faced a gloomy future. In the bottom drawer of his boyhood dresser, he fetched the bottle of wild turkey. Sitting on his bed, back against the wall, he sipped while pondering his future. What future? Andy swigged on the whiskey until he felt the familiar buzz, the welcome buffer between his unsettled core and thoughts, which made sitting alone in his room tolerable. Into that zone, it dulled the emotional pain and delayed the urgency of figuring out what to do with himself. He sat on his bed until he'd drunk enough whiskey to doze. A knock on the bedroom door intruded. "Andy," his mother said on the other side, "someone's here to see you. Are you awake, dear?" "Yes, Mom, I'll be right out." Thinking it might be someone from the church visiting, more a friend of his mother's, Andy took his time. In the bathroom, he combed his hair and gargled some of the whiskey out of his breath. In the living room, an unlikely visitor sat chatting amiably with Henry Clay, figuring out which ancestors they had in common. Tahlequah had removed his sunglasses for the occasion. Quite at home, he looked up when Andy appeared. "I guess we're related, cousin," he said, smiling. Henry Clay beamed. "The two families intersect right after Nanyahi," his father said. Andy knew as much from Lila and the fact that if you shared Cherokee blood with someone in northeastern Oklahoma, you were probably related. He thought of Lila and his failure as a lover. "Would you like to stay for dinner, Desmond?" Rebecca asked, standing in the doorway to the living room. "No thanks, Mrs. Parks," he said, full of charm. "I actually came by to see if Andy wanted to go out for a while. We were in Vietnam together, you know." "Yes," said Henry Clay, "it's quite the coincidence." Not really, thought Andy. Lots of guys from Oklahoma were in the Nam. Tahlequah is really turning on the charm. Tahlequah's car, a red Pontiac Firebird, sat parked on the opposite side of the street. Still not sure why he'd come, Andy got in the passenger side and waited for him to speak first. "Lila's worried about what happened," Tahlequah began. Not sure what he knew, Andy wasn't going to blurt out his dysfunction. "You know, it was nice that you and Lila were going out. She really likes you. I don't think much of the creeps in this town that might be taking her out if you weren't. I mean, us Vietnam vets got to stick together. You're even part Cherokee and related." He flashed Andy a grin. All facts, but the part about Lila was what interested Andy. "She doesn't understand why you left so suddenly. Are you breaking up with her?" Tahlequah sped towards Vanita. "Want to go get something to eat, maybe grab a beer?" Andy nodded. Of all he'd thought about since his failure, breaking it off with Lila had not occurred to him. "I thought she was upset with me," Andy said. "Nah, not really," he said, increasing the speed of the Firebird. "She just got her feelings hurt thinking you thought she was ugly." So, he does know. "It happened with my Peggy once," he said. "Just once, but I can tell you from experience it won't happen again." Peggy, Tahlequah's Choctaw girlfriend, had won an Indian beauty contest. An unusual name for a Choctaw girl, thought Andy, but not as bad as Andrew for a Cherokee. "Cheer up," he told Andy. "Watch this thing go." He pressed the accelerator. "Peggy and I want to take you guys out next Friday, our treat." The Friday night date with Peggy and Tahlequah went well for Andy. Reuniting with Lila, they had fun eating pizza and drinking enough beer to feel uninhibited. Taking Tahlequah's words to heart, his failure with Lila not permanent, Andy became her lover that night. The evening had not gone as well for Tahlequah. Peggy drank too much beer and openly flirted with one of the guys at a nearby table. Tahlequah glared at him, a fight averted only because the man's buddies intervened and ushered him out of the restaurant. He told Andy later, "I should have known better than to date a Choctaw. Some of their women will break your balls every time. Peggy and Tahlequah broke it off for good that night, but Andy gained a friend in Lila's cousin. So I'll read one more brief passage, and then we'll take a bit of a break. There's water. Chandra has water over at the book table. And there's a portable toilet here. I don't know if you can see it. If you have to use it, we've got some sanitizer there to kind of help prevent with the COVID. And then after the break, we'll have a question and answer period. And this last passage I'll read is also deep in part 2, and it deals with the type of triggers, the type of psychological triggers which were happening for Andy. And he knew they were happening, but he was powerless to prevent them. And the scene is kind of self-explanatory from that perspective. The only new character in the scene is Horace Thornbill, who's the preacher of the church that Andy's family goes to, and the church is very important to Andy's mother. And Andy is still occasionally attending in deference to the importance of the church to his mother. Horace Thornbill walked to the pulpit, and the congregation rose. Thick, with hair graying at the temples, the pastor looked more like a truck driver in an uncomfortable and ill-fitting suit, his occupation during the week in between sermons. He smiled at the faithful before giving thanks to the God they gathered to celebrate each Sunday. Andy tuned out the moment the pastor uttered, "Let us pray." Living with his parents because his light hauling service lacked the income to rent a place of his own, he still accompanied his mother to church occasionally. The preaching begun, Andy retreated into daydream, hypnotized by the droning voice of the minister's reverence towards a God Andy wasn't sure existed. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see a nodding congregation affirming the words of Horace Thornbill. Andy's own nods were ones of dozing after a late night in Lila's arms. The word atheist registered in Andy's consciousness. Then foxhole. The pastor rambled on about the fact there were none in the trenches of war because of a soldier's reliance on God in situations of grave danger. Andy, attentive now, remembered cursing himself for not digging in deeper during a mortar barrage that killed the new guy, Calhoun. Pressed against the earthen wall while hearing the whoomp, 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 and waiting for each blast to land, he swore some more for making the hole so wide. What protection is this, leaving so much room for a shell to land beside me? Worried about Sammy, exposed by pulling guard, it was Calhoun that died from a direct hit. Rather than finding God in the foxhole, in despair, Andy searched for pieces of the grunt's body amidst the gore. Not sure at first who'd been killed, he looked at the faces of platoon members at dawn. Finding Calhoun's dog tags in the slime, Andy knew for sure. Mechanically, he sifted through the splattered blood and tissue, confused about how much of it should be placed in the body bag. Did it matter? Angered by the death, he became determined to gather what he could of Calhoun. As Horace continued, Andy noticed the eyes of the congregation furtively looking his way. Not acknowledging the pastor or any glances, Andy stared at the back of the wooden pew in front of him, immersed in his memory of foxholes. Waiting for the last word of the sermon, he bolted to the car, knowing the after-church chit-chat would depress him. He sat and waited for his mother and Henry Clay, trying to compose himself so they wouldn't notice the degree of his withdrawal. "Are you feeling under the weather, dear?" Rebecca asked while Henry Clay drove home in silence. Maybe Dad has an inkling, he thought. Andy just wanted to be alone again and regain the outer equilibrium needed to face the world. How silly a simple-minded sermon about atheists and foxholes had the power to reduce him to a quivering mess on the inside. The episode ended his church attendance. 2 months later, another incident deepened the chasm between the before and after since resuming life in Oklahoma. Yeah, thank you.